So for the tutorial part, I thought I would tell you about the concept and the methods that we use in the type of study that we do in my group, and the part especially here that I want to talk about today, which is focused on gel materials, and we use and the type of computer simulations that we use to investigate these type of systems. So what I would like you to do is to interrupt me and ask questions as we go along. I have prepared this part in a kind of a modular way. So if we spend more time on one part, then I will be able either to skip or to go faster, just to give you a quick snippet of the remaining part so that we stay in time. So feel free to interrupt me and to ask questions as we go along. So, okay. So just a two words about my group. For people that don't know me, I'm a statistical physicist, a computational physicist, and I'm really interested in how materials, soft materials, develop their microstructure and how their process of development actually determine the way in which they behave and the way they function, and so the way we can use them. Currently in my group, there is a range of topics that we're excited about that go from multi-component networks to jam system under flow, in which we study memory effect and thixotropy. We are very interested in the connection between the material properties and the sustainability, both of the processes through which the materials are created and made, and the processes in which they are used. And because one of the material that we have studied a lot and we've been very interested in is actually gels that forms during cement hydration, then there is some part of our work that has been directly connected with the science policy issues about the problems of how to promote the use of sustainable materials for construction. So I have just some nice, figures and movies from simulation. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk more about these things. I would be delighted. But let me go in the core of what I want to tell you about. So I would like to start with this type of image to give you a sense of and to get the chance to discuss why I'm interested in gel materials. I think the gel materials that we are more used to maybe to think about as physicists and that we know better are polymer gels, which are basically polymer networks. But in general, a gel is a material that is made of a fluid in which there is a matrix that is embedded in it and that provides rigidity and mechanical properties and some of the mechanical properties. And what is the kind of the common trait of all these structures, and that I find, albeit all those made with different type of materials, what I find particularly interesting and intriguing is the fact that you have, in all cases, you have built this type of disordered network, which may seem, sort of just disordered, random type of structures, but in many cases is actually a very specifically and well-organized type of disordered network. And this is, I think, relates a lot with the people that look at these materials or study these materials in the biological context. So biopolymers self-organize in very specific way to form then biopolymer networks in various parts of biology. And here I have some images. For example, on the left, this is a colloidal gel where particles just self-assemble in a way that very difficult to control, and then builds this type of polymer networks that seem much messier and less organized. We don't have necessarily the chemical architecture that is designed in polymer networks through the chemistry that actually is maybe that we can use as a guideline, and then can be used to identify where the material properties can come from. In the center, you have a much more extreme version of that, when I have proteins that have, this is a casein gel, basically yogurt, where you have these globular proteins which then form micelles, which then form this large-scale porous structures. And on the right, something that is even messier, which is one example of this cement hydrate networks, where these are the type of gels that form during cement hydration, as I mentioned before, and you have nanoparticles that continuously precipitate, fill the space, and form this disordered, complex, porous matrix, which is then responsible for things like material strength, but also plasticity and also durability of the material itself. So the motif that the focus of our research in this context is really try to understand how these large-scale structures emerge in this type of materials, how well organized they are in spite of being genetically disordered, and then how that organization has an impact on the mechanical properties and on any other function that material will have. And so this is interesting to things like, or relates to things like supramolecular association, biological scaffold and matrices, battery materials, networks that, because are physically associated, they can break and reform and reconfigure. So these enters foods and 3D inks and all sorts of very interesting materials. Okay, so what I have done here is that I've organized my little tutorial in 3 parts. The first part is to clarify or to try to explain and to summarize in a few slides what is our logic in choosing a method to study this type of materials, what are the choices that we make, how does this compare maybe with other approaches that people have used. And then if I have the time, I want to show you some examples of how then we use these approaches to investigate the microscopic dynamics in gel networks, and then how can other examples of how we can connect that to mechanics and rheology. Okay, let me start. So basically what we would like to do is to be able to construct, I hope that I've given you a sense from how I explain the focus of our research and what is the type of questions that we are interested in. Then I think it's clear why what we are trying to do is, in fact, to develop a computational tool, a theoretical tool, in which we can, or set of tools, in which we can understand how microstructure forms, which then determines how the material can build stresses to accommodate, for example, deformation during flow, and how then this deformation changes the structure, which then changes the stresses, which then changes the response to the deformation. So it's not just building structure, it's really, or just not have ideas of some basic processes that can come up in mechanical response, but the ambition is to try to build this loop. And so the general idea is that if I think in terms that are of stresses, this capital sigma here, I hope you can see my cursor. So if I think in terms of stresses that I can try to build from the microscopic degrees of freedom that I use to describe my system, I can think that there is a contribution to the stresses that comes, for example, under flow from from relative velocities of different parts of the material, which is subjected to the flow, and it's related to the flow rate. And there is a term that actually comes from the way the forces are exchanged within the microstructure that I've built. So it's clear that in this case, I want to have a framework in which I can include the forces that create the structures, which then can react to the flow and to the deformation. And so I want to have this type of continuity from building the structure to deforming it, and then breaking it, and then deforming it. Okay. So if I think in these terms, I mean, we're not the unique group in doing that. There is a lot of actually computational groups that have developed tools and capacities to do that, and different people have different focus. Here I have some examples. So if you are interested in this type of topics, these are also names of other groups that you may be interested in looking into, and the type of work that they do. So I think that a bit what we have focused on, and maybe the hallmark of my group, is that we are particularly interested in how stresses emerge from these part of the problem that comes from the microstructure. So this idea of being able to capture the physics of the microstructure formation and how that changes with imposed deformation. Because we think that this is where actually there is the most unknown, where there is most of the many body physics that emerges and come into play, and that we really don't know how to deal with. So we hope to be able to contribute to develop this type of models. So the idea basically is that we start by identifying forces. In certain cases, we can think of potential energy from which we compute forces, and then from this we obtain the stresses. We do this for all the microscopic degrees of freedom. For example, I will show you an example where we describe center of mass of particles that so are assumed as being spherical, but you could then have different type of degrees of freedom depending on what is the microscopic building blocks that you're using. We solve for all these microscopic degrees of freedom many body equation of motion, so considering the interaction between among many of them. And from this solution of the equation of motion, we obtain the spatiotemporal evolution of the microstructure. And so then we can sort of fit in this loop to try to build that type of cycle. Okay, so what are these equations of motion that we solve? And let's say you start from this case of colloidal gels. So imagine you have colloidal particles in this type of model systems. These are well described, they're kind of similar to spheres. So in a first approximation, you can think, okay, I'm just looking at the center of mass. In certain cases, I want to follow the rotation of the spheres. But basically, I have an equation of motion where I consider that the motion of the particle happens in a solvent, so it's it's overdamped. And then I have forces that I can compute from the interaction potential between my particles, that it depends on the relative distance between the particles. And then I have a drag term that depends, again, recapitulate the presence of the solvent. And then I have a noise term that contains the information about how the dissipation in the solvent is coupled to the thermal fluctuation in the system, basically through fluctuation dissipation theorem. And so then I discretize this type of differential equation. I compute forces at every single time, knowing the position or knowing all the information about the microscopic degrees of freedom. And then from that, I compute the new force at the following time, which then allows me to compute the new position, and so on and so forth. So this is the typical way of iteratively solving equation of motion in the computer. And you have very powerful algorithms to do that. So you can extract, this is just a little cartoon that I have here on the right. If this was just one particle, I would be able to generate the whole trajectory of the particle, which comes not from a hypothesis that I've really done on what the trajectory should be, but from the microscopic forces that I put in, this ingredient of the drag and this ingredient of the thermal noise. Of course, I can do things that are more complex than that and more sophisticated than that. And I can do this at many different levels. What I choose to do will depend on what are my constraints and what I'm trying to do. In the type of things that we want to do, we want to be able not to follow one particles, but to be able to describe the whole gel structure. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about larger scale heterogeneities in these gel structures, which are very important and particularly revealing of this. I'm going to argue that they are particularly important in revealing about this connection between disorder and organization in this type of complex structures. So I want to be able to run simulations that are very large with a very large amount of particles so that I can actually collect effectively statistics and understand equilibrium and non-equilibrium processes. And so then I need my algorithm to be very accurate and efficient, because that's quite an ambitious goal. Then depending on that, I will choose how, for example, deeply I want to go in the description of the solvent and the hydrodynamics of the solvent, how detailed I want to go into that. So there are other methods in which you can add to this type of approach other more complexity about that. And this is a list of methods that are used to look at to include more complex description of the solvent in which the particles are immersed, which granted can also change the way the dynamic, of course. So, but in the first approximation, we just take this very simple description. The other simplification that or the other approximation that we do is that we don't solve the equation directly completely in the overdamped case. So now I have put in some inertia in my equation of motion. And the reason to do that, this is an approach that has become quite common, is that if I include inertia, the type of differential equation that I have to solve allows me to use algorithms that are actually more accurate and more efficient. In particular, an example of that is the Berle algorithm that is used in molecular dynamics, that is very, very powerful because it's simple, so it's efficient and it's very accurate. And so we use that. So the trick is that we use this inertial term, but then we take the drag to be sufficiently large so that the inertia, it's basically negligible. So we solve the equation with inertia, but in the limit in which basically the motion is overdamped. And this allows us to basically be more efficient in the way we solve the equation of motion. So here I have a quick description of what are the time scale. So if I have inertia, I would have a characteristic time scale in this type of equation that is just due to the vibration of the particle. Let's say if I have an attractive well in this well, but if I have this drag term and I introduce this characteristic time over which these vibrations are damped, then I can effectively study the system in the overdamped limit if I take this damping time to be small enough. So the damping is very fast, the motion is effectively overdamped. Okay, I think I gave you a sense. I'm aware of the time going fast, but I also would like to pause to see if there are questions from the audience so far.
Can I ask a question? Like you just mentioned, with the acceleration term, the algorithm is more accurate, right? So and more efficient. Is that what you said? I was trying. Could you like explain in very brief term why would it?
Yeah. So, in this algorithm, in this type of algorithms, you are discretizing your equation of motion. So you are always sort of at some level doing an expansion of your solution and computing the solution up to some order term, right? So with the same, by solving, using this type of what I mean by more efficient and more accurate algorithm is that I can basically have a higher precision while so calculating a solution that is effectively at a higher order term, so more accurate. And this allows me to afford, let's say, for example, a bit larger integration steps, or actually get, if I don't want to sacrifice that, to get effectively higher accuracy in the solution of the equation, right?
I got it.
When I have to solve the equation that is completely overdamped, this requires actually inverting some matrices, and the computation and the method, the algorithm to invert the matrices is actually much slower than this type of the type of algorithm that I can use to solve the equation with inertia.
I got it.
I can actually play with that.
I got it. Thanks.
So, okay, so now that's the general framework and the general perspective we use. We wanted, this is already an example because of course I can use that in with many different type of building blocks in my gel, many different types of selection of degrees of freedom. So what we did here is actually to focus on a model that would be effective or helpful in studying this type of issues in colloidal gels. So we thought about particles that actually in solution, they are sticking to each other. And these interactions contain some information about the solvent. So in this type of simulation, as I said, the solvent is not described explicitly. In certain cases, we've done sort of more atomistic simulation where you also consider the properties explicitly, the molecules, for example, of the solvent. as you can imagine, this becomes very challenging if I want to go to very large gel structures, right? And not only because it's computationally intensive, which I could just not cares in certain point if my computer is powerful enough, but I really need something that allows me to disentangle different aspects of the problem, and so this is a good first approach to do that. So I consider that particles stick together, and there is some, in general, different type of theories in colloidal systems allow you to compute, for example, effective uh, uh, short-range wells that would correspond to that attraction in a specific colloidal system. But then you can think that in a real colloidal system, when particles come together because of these attractive interactions, their contact are not simple in the sense that the interactions are short range. So now the surfaces can come close to each other. And then the surfaces, there can be roughness, there can be patches of attraction, there can be polymers that are grafted to sterically stabilize the particles that then constrains the relative motion. And so we have implemented this complexity just in one thing. So our interaction potential has this two-body part, and then it has a three-body term that effectively it's a function that we've written in a way that it's computationally convenient. But what it does is that when two particles come together, there is a resistance to do this type of motion. So I have here a little cartoon of two particles that are actually bound in this type of model within the attractive well. And the third particle will see this map, which represents the potential energy as it approaches these two particles that are already bound. So it will tend to bind more along this direction, and it will have to pay some price to bind along this direction. And this is basically to reproduce the fact that I was saying that in this system there may be some difficulty to form compact aggregate because the particles cannot necessarily do this, or there is some cost to pay to do this. And these tend to favor structures that are elongated in the way they grow, which then seems to be an important aspect in the formation of gel systems. And so from these type of interactions, this is what we, for example, can put in the equation of motion. We use lamps, and we have put this model in lamps, and now we've used it a lot in a number of studies of these model systems. And then now we are in the process actually of resending back our LAMPS version to the public LAMPS repository, so that in principle also other people can study it. So with these type of models, it's sufficiently simple, again, that we can build efficiently gel structures that have a lot of the physics of the real systems, and we can do very large simulations in these very dilute systems. Okay. So, for example, I didn't tell you the details of this mathematical function. I have some parameters that I can vary, right, to, for example, change the extent of these effects that I was describing in the potential energy map. And so based on that, the type of structures that I would like that the system will tend to form can be very different. Like imagine if it's everything blue, so the particles can stick everywhere and there is not this type of stiffness associated to the bond, then I will favor the formation of compact aggregate. But if I vary that angle, the energy cost, I can change a lot of structure. So this is one specific choice of these parameters that we have studied a lot, and that forms this type of network that you can see here. So I have kind of gel branches that I can easily identify because they are made by basically chains of these particles, and they can branch, as you can see here, and the branching points are easy again to identify because they are just particles with coordination number 3. So this is like a model gel structure that then we have used to study the type of how the disorder that can emerge in the formation of this structure, which is always a very interesting type of correlated disorder, then can lead to some effective organization and functionality of these materials. Here are just example of things that we can compute. Like once that I have this potential energy, I can actually look at some of the structures, local structures that are formed in simulations, and I can compute the local elasticity of the local elements that I have in my network. And for example, I could say, okay, how much the elasticity of this element then enter the mechanics that I can measure for the overall network. These are the type of problems that we've been interested in. But then I can look at the whole network, right, and compute the stresses from basically the dynamical evolution of the system. And then I can prepare gel networks in different conditions. So the snapshot that I'm showing you here is one of these networks, precisely the same type that I was showing you before, but I'm showing only the connection between the particles. And I've changed the colors and the thickness a little bit to highlight part of the network that, for example, are under tension versus under compression. So as the gel forms, depending on the kinetics of the self-assembly that we can tune by adjusting the interaction, for example, between the particles. So typically the temperature and the time over which temperature has to change. So how fast do we let the system aggregate? This can produce different types of stress distribution in the network. And the type of stress distributions are related to the type of spatial organization of the network and this type of large-scale heterogeneities that I was talking about. So the gel preparation is another aspect that you can play with in the simulation to actually tune the material properties in a way that can try to mimic what's happening really in experiments where this is what happens, right? Because depending on how you mix your gel, what are the environmental conditions, you're going to get materials that have effectively different properties. And then you can, in fact, actually do different things. So on the right-hand side here, I have just what I was saying before, that I can, after I form the gel, I can study the spontaneous dynamics of this gel. Right now I have just thermal fluctuation, the system is at rest, and I can actually investigate how this dynamics is spatially heterogeneous, is also heterogeneous in time, to try to build a connection between the different type of the structure and the overall relaxation dynamics of the system, or spontaneous dynamics in this system. I can compute things that are directly related to what people can measure, for example, with dynamic light scattering or microscopy. But then I can also subject the system to shear. Usually in these simulations, we use we still keep periodic boundary conditions by using a type of periodic boundary condition that is called Lie-Edwards, which allows to accommodate actually flow and deformation. And so, but then in other cases, we have actually imposed, had specific boundaries on our system and then pull on the boundary to deform the gel, right? So you can do both things. As usual with the periodic boundary condition, this reduces a bit, keeps under control the system sizes, reduces the number of parameters because I don't need to specify the interactions with these walls. And so if I'm just interested in the flow properties in certain aspect of properties that may not be necessarily so dependent on the confinement, that can be a preferable approach. I can do, in fact, oscillatory test, right? So I can oscillate my simulation box back and forth with a certain amplitude. And this is implemented with this set of equation here. Typically, what I will do is that I have a strain that is oscillating in time, and this translates into a rate of strain that I can directly input in the equation of motion, where I try to convince the particles to follow the flow, the formation profile that would correspond to that strain rate. That is this equation that you have here, but this is a compromise that has to be reached with the forces between the particles, and this gives me basically allows me to compute stresses and moduli, right? Computing Fourier transform and so on. And we have done this in the linear regime and in the nonlinear regime. In the linear regime, we have implemented the technique that was developed experimentally by the group of Gareth McKinley at MIT and by Bevan Keshavarz and Michaela Jerry that now are at Duke University, where they found a very smart way to use, instead of this simple oscillating strain, which then I have to change, for which I have to change the frequency and then compute the frequency, the response for every frequency to compute my viscoelastic spectrum. They proposed the idea of having this chirped signal that have been modulated in amplitude and frequency to optimize the quality of the signal that you get. And we have implemented this type of chirped approach in the simulation as well. And I'm happy to answer more questions about this in the email as well. Feel free to reach out to me. On the left, I have a very simple way to do to apply a continuum shear, which I like very much because it allows me to kind of think in a very abstract way to the deformation process. So what we do is that we take the configuration of the particles, and then we apply as an affine deformation, so a shear deformation to everybody. So we displace every particle as if it was moving affinely with this shear deformation, but of a tiny step. And then we let the system evolve over a given amount of time so that it can readjust its configuration and produce the stresses to accommodate that tiny deformation. And then we iterate this process many times. And by changing the time that I let the system evolve between one deformation step and the other, I propose that this is equivalent to changing the rate of my deformation. And I can study, it's very efficient actually to study both the affine, the non-affine motion, to have directly access in a very controlled way to the relaxation dynamics in this type of systems.